Welcome to the channel. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Now join me today for the third and what I'm hoping to be the final part of the three-way comparison that I have with the Octopus Kraken, the Seestern and the IX&DAO 39mm titanium divers. So the first episode covered the difference in specification and dimensions and also the pricing. Part 2 covered all the differences that you see on the A face, so the dial, hands, loom and also the bezel inserts. In this part 3, we're going to actually look at the bezel rotation, the construction of the bezel, the whole case, and the whole bracelet, and I will try and fit in a bit of a summary if I can. Now, it's very difficult amongst three watches. If you follow the first two parts, you know how similar they are and how different they are. So let's kick this off and let's start looking at the first thing which is bezel rotation. So let's start off on the IX&DAO. This is a 60-click unidirectional bezel. The clicks are quite precise and it sounds pretty decent for titanium as well. And there is a touch of just a bit of play, I mean very minimal, but you can definitely feel a bit of play in the actual bezel. Next up is the Seestern. Now we already checked this out on the full review, but let's go again. Now when done slowly, you can feel all the clicks. And again, at a very slow pace, it seems fine. However, it is a bit loose. There's no real movement in it, slightly lesser than the IX&DAO. But the problem with this bezel is I feel it's just a touch too loose, and I've seen this across more than one model, and that is a consistent issue with this bezel. Now moving on to the Octopus Kraken. So as you guys can probably hear, the Octopus Kraken has the best bezel rotation amongst these three watches. It's very precise, it's got a very smooth rotation as well. It is quite tactile, and you can hear all the individual clicks, and it feels the best. They all line up, there's no difference in there, and this is solid. There's literally no movement in this, and it is by far the best sounding bezel. Now let's look at the bezel construction. This is where we see another slight difference. Even though they look the same, they all have very slightly different teeth. So if you look at the Seestern and the IX&DAO, they have probably the most similar construction in the way the teeth are designed. The IX&DAO does slightly differ. There's a bit more of a slope on the teeth, whereas the Octopus Kraken, you can see the edge has been straightened off or squared off. You can see how the edges of those teeth are actually very flat in comparison to the other two, which are quite spiky. Now, with that being said, surprisingly, the Octopus Kraken feels the most grippiest out of these three. Now that we have the bezels done, we are going to take a look at the case. Now, the first place where we want to look at for a difference is actually the crown guards. In terms of the finishing on the case, they're all exactly the same. They are circular brushed. You might find a slight difference in the grain. I have noticed that between the Octopus Kraken and the IX&DAO, they're both the same in terms of the level of grain that you see. The Seestern is slightly different, but you can't see on camera, so I'm not going to show that. Another thing which I want to show you is actually the case backs. While not overly important, the case backs on the Octopus Kraken and the Seestern are, sterile, plain as anything, nothing on there at all. You will find the IX&DAO actually has some text there, just specifications, nothing special, but it is a bit different than the other two. Now moving on to the actual differences on the case. Now all three watches have very different crown guards, and I'll show you the main difference if I can. The main difference that I've noticed is the actual slope of the actual guard itself. Now I'll show you in pictures where they all do differ. I mean, they've got a slight different shape where the crown actually sits, and on picture I can demonstrate that a lot better. You can see that while they look very similar, again, they do look quite a bit different. I don't think any one is better. I just think they're quite different. What I can say about all of them, they do a really good job of housing the crown. They don't stick out too much. I do like how slim all three watches are in terms of the crown guard profile. But when we turn the watch on the side, we further see a bit of a difference. If you look at the tips of those crown guards, the points, they are finished quite differently. You've got a more of a squared off tip on the Seestern, whereas the IX&DAO is slightly narrower, and I think the Octopus is somewhere in the middle with just slightly more squared off ends to those crown guards. With regards to the difference in actual crown size, so the IX&DAO, the Seestern, and the Octopus Kraken surprisingly all have the same diameter. They're all 6.9 mil. Where they differ is on the width. Now, while the IX&DAO and the Seestern are both at 3.8 millimeters in terms of width, the Octopus Kraken visibly does have a much slimmer crown, and that comes in at 3.2. While it's not much of a difference, but it does not affect the usage at all. Now, there's another difference we'll see is on the finishing. Now, I had to go in quite close for this. So when we look at the lug tips, this is where we're going to see our next difference, and we need to pay attention to the beveled edges. Now, usually on steel cases, these beveled edges are polished, but with this being titanium, they have included the bevel edges, but they've brushed them. So the main difference that you see is while the Seestern and the Octopus Kraken both have horizontal brushing, you'll find that IX&DAO does have vertical brushing on that thin slither, and that's clearly visible under the right light. And there is a slight difference in this in the bevel. Some do taper, some don't taper. So I think the Octopus Kraken has quite a slim bevel in comparison to the Seestern, but the IX&DAO does have more of a taper. It starts off wide towards the bottom of the lug, and then it just gets thinner as it gets, right on the edge of that watch. So again, a small difference, which further leads me to think that these can't be the same factory surely, because there's too many small differences when you do look up close. So those are the differences that we see on the case. Now we're going to turn our attention to the bracelet. Effectively, all three bracelets are the same in terms of they're a 3-link design. They all solid end links. They all have screw-in links, and they all come with twin pushes on the clasp which do fold over, and you've got milled internals. So they all do taper down from 20 millimeters down to 15.7 mil at the clasp. But when we look at the individual links, while they are all 3-link bracelets, the links do vary quite largely. So the first thing we are going to look at is the actual length of the links on these bracelets. Seestern, the length of these links, which is the side links and the center links, is 10 millimeters. Now when we look at the Octopus Kraken, that is 8.8. So again, the actual length of the links on the side and the center links, 8.8. The IX&DAO is just 0.1 mil smaller. It's coming in at 8.7 mil. Now all these links are slightly curved, as you can see. Now that adds a great benefit when this watch is on wrist. It does add to the articulation. Even the Seestern does have a very mild sort of curve in there, but whereas with the shorter links, you do get more of a curvature. In terms of the thickness of those links, so the Seestern does have the thinnest links at 3.1 millimeters. The Octopus and the IX&DAO both are at 3.5 millimeters. So quite a variety in dimensional difference just on the bracelets alone. So they are definitely from different places. Now the last thing we want to check out is of course the clasps. The clasps, I believe, on these watches are very important. Now I'll say this before I start off, I don't think any one of these watches have got the clasp right. I think the original product did come with a dive watch clasp. Now because these are dive watches, I can't for the life of me understand why we would get these dress watch style or sports watch style clasps. You've only got 3 micro adjusts, which is not too bad. It's actually okay for sizing. However, we know the issue with the Seestern clasp. This is the new and improved clasp. You can see they've had to kind of budge it up, drill another hole in there just to make sure that those clasps close without a big gap. The Octopus Kraken, got that aspect right from the start, but again, I mean, this clasp is not actually titanium. It is steel. You can see that by the polished bevels and the different kind of brushing on there, which I don't mind at all. It does have a really nice finish, but again, I feel it's the wrong type of clasp on a dive watch. I really want a dive watch clasp. Now the IX&DAO is slightly different. They've tried to make it better, but still they still have 3 micro adjustments. They've got like half a clasp really. There's no flip lock, there's no dive extension, etc. Now the IX&DAO is probably my favorite out of the 3, sorry, because it is a bit longer. So just for reference, the Seestern is 26.8 millimeters in length. That's just the whole length of the clasp. The Octopus comes in at 28 millimeters, slightly larger, and the IX&DAO is at 33 millimeters. They're all 18.4 mil wide. So yeah, while I couldn't understand why neither of these watches gave us a dive watch clasp, and of course we have the San Martin on the other hand, which is not titanium at all, but it does have the right clasp, and for that fact it has a much better clasp, which is with the on-the-fly adjustment. Now even with the Seestern having improved the clasp, you'll find when it's compared against the other two, the clasp on close position still shows a larger gap than the other two. It's nowhere near as big, and it's actually not an issue anymore. It's a very normal gap. But when we compare the Seestern versus the Octopus Kraken and the IX&DAO, you'll find the IX&DAO has the least amount of gappage when the clasp is closed, followed by the Octopus and then the Seestern. But you can see it is much better than it was in comparison to the older clasp. You can just see a big difference. So this is probably the most difficult comparison I've done, not in terms of difficulty of doing the comparison, in terms of making a summary or a judgment. Every time I've done comparisons, from the get-go, I kind of know which way I'm leaning towards. But in this case, I thought I was leaning between the Octopus and the Seestern, but the IX&DAO definitely has thrown a few spanners in the work. So it is very difficult to decide. Ultimately, I think a couple of you guys said this in the comments, that ultimately it is a very subjective decision. Neither one of these watches has anything which I consider to be a deal breaker. They all have slight pros and cons. They all have very subjective preferences. If you look at the Octopus Kraken, not everybody would like the name. There's some things that you will prefer on this. I mean, for sure, the Octopus Kraken has the much better bezel rotation. But in terms of everything else, like with regards to the Seestern, it has a true NH38 movement, which is true dateless. The bezel is quite loose, but I prefer the branding of the Seestern and the text on the dial versus the Octopus Kraken. The Octopus Kraken still has a ghost position, but then the IX&DAO comes in with just something just slightly bit different. I think nicer hour markers, for example. Obviously, it doesn't have the same type of bezel rotation. However, it does have a PT5000, which is dateless. They've removed the mechanism. I've not seen that before on another PT5000, so this shows some technical know-how from IX&DAO. There's again, very subjective, right? There's nothing really between them. As I said, no deal breakers at all, just preferences. I feel a lot of you guys might prefer the Octopus Kraken because of just the dimensional difference. It is a touch smaller, just around a millimeter than the other two. They're all priced very similarly as well, around the £220 mark. So it's something, again, what you prefer on all the smaller features that I've mentioned. And now the decision is up to you to choose which one you like. Now, surprisingly, towards the end of the review, as I was trying on these watches and I was spending a couple of hours with these, the IX&DAO stood out from all the other watches that I had on wrist. For me, I don't know why, guys, the IX&DAO seemed to fit the best and look the best. As soon as I put this on, there was just something about this IX&DAO that I thought, you know what, this is the one. It just feels so much better on wrist. I literally do not know why. I do like the visuals a bit. I think, with the darker tone of text that you see here, it does kind of sit in the background. It doesn't really get in the way of everything. It stays slightly understated. Even these smaller lines of text, the darker red. And I think it's probably because we're used to seeing that vibrancy of the red on the text over there and this white text, where the IX&DAO just feels a bit different. But aside from the aesthetics, purely on fit, I do prefer the IX&DAO. And as I said, I'm scratching my head. I really don't know why. It just seems to fit better. It looks a bit better on wrist. And that is my preference. So again, it's totally subjective. Now, even with this on wrist, I'm not even thinking about the 60 click unidirectional bezel at all. I'm just thinking that, you know what, having these two watches on wrist, I much prefer this. I'm on wrist size 6.5 inches. And not to say, again, these both are very proportionate in dimensions and they both fit brilliantly on wrist, but just something about the IX&DAO. So that's all I can say, guys. Unfortunately, I can't leave you with a solid answer, but as I said, this is extremely subjective. One of the most closest comparisons I've ever done to date, and you have to leave it, unfortunately, up to subjectivity to make your choice. So hope you guys enjoyed that little mini series and hope you gained a lot of information from that. So again, thanks for watching. I'll leave all links for all three watches in my description. Check out any which one that you prefer to, and I will see you on the next video.